Thank you very much for being with us this evening. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Carolyn Stefanko, the president of the College of St. Rose, and I see people waving at me. That's lovely. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the inaugural Michael and Margaret Picotte Presidential Lecture in Higher Education, Innovation, and Leadership. We're sorry that Michael and Margie, which is what the name that she goes by, could not be with us this evening. But I want to begin certainly by acknowledging their generosity in endowing this new lecture series. The entire Picotte family has been a great friend to the college over time. They donated the building on State Street in downtown Albany that is now our Center for Art and Design, and they supported the building of the Kathleen McManus Picotte Recital Hall within the Masry Center for the Arts, which is certainly a jewel of a performance venue in the Capital Region. So we're very grateful to the Picotte family. But the question is, why did Michael and Margie establish this lecture series? And the answer really is because they saw a need for innovative college and university leaders to address the challenges of the 21st century, and they wanted to support our board of trustees and me in leading change. And tonight, we have several members of our board with us, and I want to first acknowledge Board Chair Sister Mary Ann Heenan, and also our trustees Kevin O'Connor, Matt Matarazzo, and his lovely wife Ann, and Hal Williams for their decades of dedication to St. Rose. So would you please stand, and we'll give you a round of applause. Thank you for being with us. I also want to express appreciation to our speaker, Sue Cunningham, for making time in her incredibly busy travel schedule to deliver the first lecture in this series. Having a speaker of your caliber, Sue, is certainly going to set a high bar for who we invite in the future, and I thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's also been a pleasure to work with Amanda Adolph-Four, who is Senior Communications Advisor to the President for CASE, who's right up here in the front. And at St. Rose, Lisa McKenzie in Institutional Advancement, who recently assumed the role of Interim Vice President, and her staff, Lisa Haley Thompson in the President's Office, and Jen Gish and her staff in Marketing and Communications, arranged and promoted this evening's event, and I want to thank all of them for their hard work as well. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Sue Cunningham. Sue Cunningham is President and CEO for the Council for Advancement and Supportive Education, which is known as CASE, which provides support to over 3,600 schools, colleges, and universities worldwide in developing their alumni relations, communications, fundraising, and marketing operations in order to advance their institutions. As CASE President and CEO, Sue provides strategic and operational leadership for one of the largest associations of education-related institutions in the world, with members in more than 80 countries. She became president of CASE in March of 2015, and a little more than 1 year later, I met her, and she probably doesn't remember this, when she served as a faculty member for a seminar that I completed at Harvard on advancement leadership for presidents. Our paths crossed again last summer at the July CASE Summit for Leaders in Advancement in New York, and after listening to her remarks on that occasion, I concluded that she was the absolute best person to speak this evening and to inaugurate this new lecture series. For those of you who know St. Rose well, you will understand why, as a global woman leader who fosters talent and diversity, Sue champions our goals as an institution. So we're really grateful that you're with us. Now, in addition to Harvard, Sue gives of her time to many institutions and organizations. She serves on the steering committee of the Washington Higher Education Secretariat, is a member of the Council of Higher Education Management Associations and the International Women's Foundation, and belongs to the fundraising committee for the Aurora Foundation. Prior to CASE, Sue was vice principal for advancement at the University of Melbourne and the director of development for the University of Oxford. She also worked as a Director of Development at Christ Church, Oxford, and as a Director of External Relations at St. Andrews University earlier in her career. She's an honorary fellow of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, and a recipient of the Case Europe Distinguished Service Award and the Case Crystal Apple Award. She holds a master's degree from Oxford University and a bachelor's degree from Middlesex University. Now, our plan was, and Sue has agreed to this, that towards the end of her talk, she would take time for some questions. And as we often do in this venue, there are index cards on your seats. And so as you think of questions, and we have Lisa over here demonstrating the index cards. We have the Vanna White of St. Rose. So if you would please think of questions and write them down, and you may pass them to either Lisa Thompson over here or Lisa McKenzie, because we can't have enough Lisas at St. Rose, over here on my left anyway. And they will collect them and they will give them to Sue, and we'll ask Sue to answer as many as possible before our event concludes. So at this time, I'm going to turn the podium over to Sue. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, President Stefanko, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening in this lovely space at this wonderful college. As you can tell from my accent, I was born in California. No, I really was born in California, but spent much of my life in the UK and Australia, and now it's my pleasure to be back in the United States. I'd like to invite you to consider the words in many university mottos: wisdom, knowledge, hope, service, integrity, daring, future, learning, study, diligence, pursuit, truth, leading, faith, perseverance, light. These are the ideals that have guided the pursuit of scholarship for millennia. I just landed back in Washington, D.C. on Monday evening, just 2 days ago, when I received a phone call from a longtime friend and mentor, Bill McGoldrick. He asked me if I'd seen the images and heard the news. He meant, of course, the news about the Notre Dame Cathedral framed by the orange light of flames. The shock spread nearly as fast as the news. And in radio interviews I heard the following morning driving to work, a prominent French philanthropist was interviewed in tears whilst on business in Hong Kong. Tributes to the symbol of Paris, and perhaps of all of France, have poured in, as we all know, from around the world, and people began sharing their images of that iconic cathedral. And of course, this is the pace of our world today. A cathedral more than 850 years old that took more than 200 years to build can transfix an entire world within minutes of a fire breaking out in it. Similarly, and I should note more positively, a week ago today, the world was transfixed by images of a black hole captured for the first time, showing physical evidence of what had until that point in time been theory. And these two stories meld history and technology, place and meaning, past and present, heart and mind. And it is interesting that in both, the bright orange light is a dominant image. And in the black hole, we see something that is 55 million light years away, a modern capturing of an ancient universe. In the images of Notre Dame, we see the strange beauty of the cathedral's rose window with an orange glow from the inside. Such beauty amidst loss. And we saw images of both, and opinions, I should note, move around the globe in an instant. This is the speed of the world today, and this is the context in which our colleges and universities work. And we're here this evening to talk about the value of higher education. Some might say that colleges and universities operated in unprecedented times with unprecedented pressures, and we will explore some of those tonight. In my experience, our beloved institutions continue to build to the future through teaching and through research. And they also play an important and civic role, a vital role, for the community and that conversation. We are also experiencing profound change in our sector in an era of such rapid movement, literally such dizzying pace. This lecture itself is a realization of the value placed on the College of St. Rose by Michael and Maggie Picotte, celebrating the college's commitment to innovation in higher education, and I'm extraordinarily honored to have been invited to be the inaugural speaker. And tonight I wanted to reflect upon three interconnected themes that profoundly impact colleges and university: the increasingly global nature of our work, the importance of deep engagement with our communities, and the value of education, including the negative narratives that seem to be increasing in volume. It excites me that the College of St. Rose places such high value on real-world experiences. I've spent my first 4 years as president of CASE having real-world experiences. And sometimes I think I'm the most fortunate person I know. My husband and my dog Wombat, due to my extended absence, don't always agree. But since January, I've had the opportunity to meet with thousands of CASE members at a handful of the many conferences we hold. In January, I was with 1,200 advancement leaders in Philadelphia from independent K-12 schools at our annual joint conference with the National Association of Independent Schools. I then had the privilege of attending CASE's second advancement conference in the Middle East, held in Dubai. I followed that by a trip to Monterrey in Mexico for our annual Latin American Congresso, and just 2 days ago, I returned to our headquarters in Washington, D.C. from our conference, our Asia Pacific Advancement Conference, which for the first time was held in Australia, in Brisbane. There were other trips too, of course, to fit into that period, to our London office and to other meetings in the US and in Canada. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear that it isn't the traveling, the airports, and the countless hours in flight that make me fortunate. It is the people I'm privileged to meet who work tirelessly for their schools and for their colleges and for their universities, spreading the word about the life-changing activity that takes place therein. And it also gives me the opportunity to learn from different perspectives, from different experiences, and of the commonalities and the variances across geographies. Institutional leaders and people in my profession, advancement made up of alumni relations, of communications, of development, fundraising, of marketing, advancement services, are those who spend their time at the intersection of our communities. We translate the places we know so well as insiders of colleges and universities to those who may love our institutions dearly, but may not be steeped in the same lingo, shorthand, and culture of our workplaces. I'm privileged to work with these ambassadors, CASE members, over 90,000 of them, from, as has already been indicated, 3,600 institutions or more in 82 countries around the world. And the beauty of this network is the breadth of its sharing. The learning that occurs across regions, disciplines, and time zones enables advancement teams to take best practices and insights to their institutions in order to do their good work better. And this begets my first point. Though our members are coming from institutions that are competing for students with each other and across continents, the community of CASE membership, of which I'm very proud, is a global learning community. The culture of sharing and learning across geographies has supported the advancement of education. It has made our institutions better. It has made CASE better able to serve its members and has led to innovation and advancement practices across the regions. Take Australia, for example, where I have just returned from. The work of institutional advancement in Australia is relatively new and started actually in independent schools, in high schools rather than universities. When I was invited to move to the University of Melbourne in 2011 to lead its Believe campaign, fundraising was an aspiration, but something that the university had really not pursued very seriously before that. Before that, as has mentioned, I was serving at the University of Oxford, where I was leading a campaign, the largest outside of the US at that point in time, to raise £1.25 billion. And the work of fundraising and creating the culture for fundraising to succeed is more nascent in Australia, but people are, of course, just as committed to advancing their institutions there as they are here. And one of the luxuries that exists in that part of the world is that we were able to take the best learning from different parts of the world and refine it and apply it to that particular environment. We could shortcut the learning curve, advance at times with less historical baggage, and also be more nimble as we created approaches that worked there. They had been importing talent from the United Kingdom, from Canada, and the United States, in addition to growing their own, and thus the advancement workforce itself is becoming increasingly global. And this transfer of people and ideas helps shape our work in well-established and also in very novel ways. Another illustration of global exchange of ideas and expertise in our field is demonstrated by university marketing professionals in the United Kingdom. There has been a longer emphasis on marketing at institutions there, I would argue, than there has been in the United States. It is more comfortable for most universities there to understand marketing as a business function. This is relative to this country, where in some contexts, marketers will struggle with being maligned and perceived as being too corporate at the expense of the institution's heart and mission. But of course, we know that it's not an either-or. Our colleges and universities must function in fiscally sound ways in order to ensure that they can support the teaching and the scholarship and the vital service to community that they provide. Sound practices like marketing enable our institutions to bring in the students that we need each year. Educational marketing is more mature in the UK, enabling institutions in the US and elsewhere to learn from their counterparts abroad. And this provides further reason for why I'm so fortunate. I have the opportunity to experience this cross-cultural, cross-geographical, cross-discipline learning within my organization, and also see how our members across the world are benefiting so that they are better able to tell the stories, the remarkable stories of their institutions. We are a global community sharing ideas. We learn from each other, and the knowledge evolves and develops in a manner that is appropriate to different cultures and different regions. Collaboration has long been a cornerstone of academic activity. Engagement globally is a fundamental aspect of higher education, regardless of where the home institution may be. And I'd like to share 3 very specific experiences of this, one in relation to engaging with alumni and other supporters outside of my institution's home country, a second about applying models from other countries to innovate the work of an institution, and third, something about CASE's transition and our mission as an organization to become truly global. So first of all, thinking about working with alumni and supporters outside of our own country. When I was at Oxford and I was encouraged in my early times running development at the university, I was told on several occasions there are many alumni and potential donors in Hong Kong and you should really go and talk to them. So I headed off to Hong Kong for the first time in my career to meet with several of them. And what I heard from them was that, Oxford has been coming to Hong Kong for 12 years or more, but really for us to believe that you want to be connected and committed to us, we need to see you actually put your feet on the ground. We actually need to see you set up a physical base in Hong Kong. And so I went back to Oxford, and this is an organization that is nearly 900 years old, so moving things quickly isn't always easy. But that said, there was enough appreciation of the importance of that idea that that's exactly what we did. And I still remember walking around Hong Kong looking for our first office for Oxford University in China, based in Hong Kong, with a very helpful alumnus called Chris Drake, and I was learning all sorts of things. We found an office in the center of Hong Kong, which was much cheaper than any of the other offices, and I said, Chris, this should be it. And he said, no, the reason the offices in this building are much cheaper is because it has very bad feng shui, and we can't be here. So we found an office not very far away, which was slightly more expensive. But setting up that office in time, in building relationships over time, which, of course, our work is all about doing, resulted in much, much greater engagement, whilst not underestimating the challenge of setting up an office a long way away. And when I was the other side of the pond, when I was working at Christchurch at one of the colleges in Oxford, I remember early on coming to the United States because alumni in the United States to this college were incredibly devoted and dedicated. And a wonderful alumnus, a gentleman called Peter Payne, who lives not very far from here, had been running the American Friends of this college for many moons. And I remember going to meet with Peter, and we looked at the alumni in the United States and how many of them were engaged and how many of them were giving. And I went to meet with many of them to talk about why they were giving or why they were not giving. And several said, well, I don't really want to give because the only thing I'm being allowed to give to is to support Americans to study at my college in Oxford. And actually, I'm British, I moved to the States, I'd like to support other things at the college. Would I be permitted to do that? And I remember talking to Peter as we built the program about how we might offer people all sorts of opportunities to engage with the college. And over time, Peter and I did just that and built a program of much deeper and greater engagement, but enormously appreciative of the huge work of Peter and the other volunteers here. And my third story about international engagement was when I was working at the Oxford University and we were going to visit with alumni in India. And the timing of our visit to India was at the same time as the government had just approved legislation to allow international universities to open campuses in India. And you've all who've traveled overseas have had that experience where you go up to the immigration desk and they say, what are you doing here? And you say, well, I'm here on business or pleasure, and they let you go through by and large, unless you look too shady. And I remember approaching the immigration desk just after this news had broken with my president, with the Vice Chancellor of Oxford at the time. And when the immigration person said, so what are you doing here? And we said, we're here to meet alumni. And he said, where are you from? And we said, the University of Oxford. And he said, are you going to be opening a campus here? He'd obviously been reading the headlines. And my president said, probably not, because I can't imagine creating the grey drizzle in India that is a hallmark of Oxford. So no, I don't think we're going to be doing that. But the value of engaging with alumni there was profound. Thinking about concrete examples of institutions applying models from universities outside their own countries has been something that I've been really impressed by and excited by. And I've already mentioned how advancement as a profession has moved around the globe. In the 1990s in the UK, many Americans and Canadian staff were brought in to help establish advancement functions at the universities there. And Case, in the view of British universities becoming very interested in building advancement, actually opened our office, our first international office in London in 1994, 2 decades after we were established here. But at the University of Melbourne, which I joined in 2011, some years earlier, the president, an individual called Glyn Davis, had radically changed the university's whole academic model. And this is a university with something like 40,000 students at the time. And Glyn had spent his early years as a postgraduate, as a postdoc. He'd been honored to receive the Harkness Fellowship and spent a couple of years here in the States at UC Berkeley, at Harvard's Kennedy School and the Brookings Institute. And what he fell in love with during his brief time of study in the United States was the liberal arts model of education and the fluidity and the ability for students not to have to decide in their first year of study what they're going to commit to for their entire time of education and their career, but having the capacity to explore and discover themselves through their academic journey. So in 2005, when he arrived at the University of Melbourne, which at the time had something like 100 different undergraduate degrees and a couple of graduate degrees, began the work of building consensus in the institution about shifting the whole university to a liberal arts model. And after 3 years, that's exactly what he did. So they moved to having 6 undergraduate degrees and a whole set of graduate schools. And what that had done to the institution by the time I arrived in 2011 was pretty profound. It had moved the institution from being something like 120 in the World League tables to being around the 40 mark. It had shifted the whole model of student patterns in Australia, where there's largely a pattern of students going to their local university to students coming from interstate to study at the University of Melbourne because of the program. It had seen universities from other parts of the world, from Aberdeen, for example, in the UK, from the opposite coast of Australia, the University of Western Australia, come to study what became called the Melbourne model. And the final thing it did, international student numbers in Australia have been building over recent years. And by the time I arrived, Melbourne had something like 30 to 35% of its student body was from outside Australia. At CASE, we've been very guided by our strategic plan, Reimagining CASE, which we completed at the end of my first year. And fundamental to that plan that evolved through engagement with our members is a new governance structure necessary to realize our goals. And these goals include, critically, CASE achieving its full potential as a global resource for institutional advancement. And this refined emphasis is meant to help us align our work better across continents and geographic boundaries. We currently have offices in Washington, D.C., as you've heard, and London, and we've subsequently opened offices in Singapore and in Mexico City. And so we're having to think differently as we're seeking to be more global about how we can be more matrixed and more connected around the world with information flowing in different directions. And things that seem really simple but are actually really complicated need to be considered. For example, our use of language and how we spell things. When I'm emailing somebody in the UK, I'll use an S instead of a Z. When I'm emailing someone in Canada, I get confused about whether they use S's or Z's. But being sensitive to what will sit well with the recipient as opposed to what will land and be seen to be coming from a very different place if we're seeking to be truly global. And also being conscious of national perceptions and biases in order to be most effective. And even simple things like arranging meetings. If we're trying to arrange meetings across 3 or 4 continents, we of course have to think about different time zones. And early on I was saying to colleagues, it's really not fair that we're setting up a meeting where we're expecting a volunteer to be on the phone at 11 p.m. at night. In order for them to participate. Though of course, if you have people the other side of the world, sometimes that's necessary. But the benefit of this global connection is really beginning to flourish. And one example of that is our program of graduate trainees, which is really about building the profession, about seeking to bring more and more people out of college into the advancement profession because we need more and more people in it. And the program began 10 years ago in the UK and was then established in Asia Pacific in Australia about 4 years ago, and is now, we launched it here in the US and Canada last year. And one of the moments that I'm most excited, and Amanda points out the joy on my face when I'm involved in this, wherever I am in the world, is bringing all of those graduate trainees together. So there are something like 35 of them, to have a symposium every 3 or 4 months where we bring in different speakers that I'm interviewing to talk about their careers, but seeing all the faces on the wall of someone who's half asleep with their second glass of wine in Australia to someone who's just got out of bed and actually doesn't want to have their picture out at all in California. But the bright questions coming from all different parts of the world and that sense of connectivity. But of course, we're also seeing a new set of challenges to the globalization of higher education. I sense a growing national resistance to a globalized mindset at the highest levels of government. And I'm not just talking about this country. The 2016 Brexit referendum and the continuing struggle for the British Parliament to create a plan has created great uncertainty for UK universities around research funding. The EU has been a really important source of research funding for British universities, and also student and faculty movement. And in the United States, resistance to globalization at federal policy level has created some uncertainty and instability at institutions around the hiring of international faculty and staff and the attraction of international students. The perception that the US is increasingly unwelcome as a destination, and I say perception because I believe it is perception alone, has led international students to choose to study elsewhere in some cases. Our members at Canadian institutions have noted the very real Trump bump experienced in Canada, where they are seeing, we were at the University of British Columbia for our board meeting last year, and they had seen an 85% increase in applications from foreign students. Which they largely ascribed to the Trump bump and to Brexit, and also an increase in the number of applications from United States students who wanted to study in Canada. And this raises difficulties for institutions that were strategically looking to increase international population as a means for creating a more dynamic environment for all students, and also as a financial tool to generate higher international tuition revenue. And genuinely, students all over the world have more choice. which makes competition steeper for institutions everywhere who seek out international students at undergraduate and graduate level. And yet we know the presence of international students, as is the case here, is so profoundly enriching both for those students and the domestic students who have an opportunity to work side by side with them. An increasingly global, or at the very least mobile community, makes the need for meaningful engagement that much more important. And in my career, I've experienced the power of advancement and the impact it's had both on educational institutions and vitally on their communities also. And these communities are integral to colleges and universities, and of course vice versa. And we exist, they exist in an ecosystem together. Meaningful engagement is integral to collective success. And sometimes those of us in education might benefit from thinking a little more outside in, instead of considering what the community can do for the institution, move the conversation towards what community and institution can achieve together. For example, in considering alumni, CASE advocates for engagement with alumni on multiple dimensions so their needs are met. US News and World Report rates alumni engagement as the percentage of alumni who gave to the institution. That's the only measure they use. And last fall, when their most recent report was published, I argued in an opinion piece that the alumni ratings used was an unhelpful tool, where the denominator continues to grow as institutions become more successful at finding alumni and, of course, graduating students. And this creates a situation where the measure of alumni engagement almost inevitably results in a downward trend. Instead, we advocate for continuing engagement of alumni in the institution through lifelong learning, through mentoring and careers and recruitment partnerships, through mutually beneficial volunteer opportunities, through experiences such as this lecture and other events, and through communication about achievements and successes and seeking the support of alumni in advocating for their institutions. And CASE is in the midst currently of beta testing new metrics for measuring alumni engagement more effectively, and when they're finalized, we look forward to sharing them with US News and World Report. And of course, philanthropic engagement is also vital in ways that are meaningful to both alumni and their institution. In addition to alumni engagement, there is considerable conversation taking place here and abroad about the roles of colleges and universities in the communities and regions in which they reside. In the United Kingdom, the Civic Universities Commission, and I was honored to meet with the commissioners a few months ago, recently looked at the role of the universities in their place, how they were serving the residents of the cities who aren't their students but are their neighbors. And at our most recent CASE Board of Trustees meeting held at the University of San Diego, trustees heard from academic staff at the university who participate in the institution's anchor programs, work which includes meaningful community outreach in the entire metropolitan San Diego area, which includes neighboring Tijuana in Mexico. When we look outside in and apply that to campaign development, it creates a better sense of involvement across members of the community and leads to a culture that is more able to help the university achieve campaign success. And I remember when we were building to launch the campaign at the University of Melbourne, which we did in 2013, one of the things that was really heartening, and of course the campaign had philanthropic goals about advancing the institution, but I think what campaigns can do profoundly is amplify the great work of the institution. And I remember being at one of our campaign launches and one of our alumni approaching me at the end of the evening saying, "Thank you so much for being here to share the remarkable work of our university." At another event that we held in Paris, in the home of an alumnus called Sam Pizarre, and we didn't have very many alumni in Paris, so we invited key contacts to the university in Paris. And one was from the head of a French research agency, an agency that really didn't have a profound connection with the University of Melbourne at all. But because the head of the institution came to the dinner and sat next to our head of research, a relationship began to be kindled, which resulted in time in some collaboration. And who would have thought, out of a philanthropic campaign, that such a relationship would be born? But indeed, philanthropic campaigns, because they amplify the important work of institutions, achieve a number of remarkable outcomes. And thinking differently about engagement enables colleges and universities to think differently about philanthropy and focus on its impact. When we were developing the campaign for the University of Oxford, I was out meeting alumni in Sydney and was at a dinner hosted by an alumnus in Mosman in Sydney, a guy called Ian Buchanan. And at this dinner was another alumnus called Richard Potok, who runs a charity in Australia called the Aurora Foundation that is focused on providing educational opportunities to Indigenous Australians. And over dinner we were talking about whether an Indigenous Australian had ever studied at the University of Oxford. And I had to confess I didn't have any idea, and went back and did as much research as I could over the 900 years of Oxford history. And as far as we could discover, there had never been an Indigenous Australian who studied at Oxford. So long story short, out of that conversation, Richard and I, with obviously the support of the university's leadership, got to work on raising money for a series of scholarships, which were named the Charlie Perkins Scholarship. And Charlie Perkins actually was an Indigenous Australian who was a football player who, when he was playing soccer in Oxford many years earlier, had seen himself surrounded by colleges and thought, I should go and study. And when he went back to Australia, that's exactly what he did. But so these scholarships were born out of this conversation, which have resulted in over 43 Indigenous Australians now doing graduate programs, not just at Oxford and Cambridge, but at different institutions here as well. And another story I wanted to share with you in terms of what grows out of the relationships born of true engagement was the story some 8 years ago when I was sitting having breakfast in Oxford and just heading into work, when I heard on the radio about the earthquake and the tsunami that had resulted in the Fukushima disaster in Tokyo. And when I got into the office, I emailed the head of a foundation in Tokyo, a very lovely man called Noriboro Maruyama, who was head up the Urahiro Foundation at that stage. And I'd met him several months earlier in his offices in Tokyo, and he came first to my mind, and I sent him an email saying that I hoped that he and his family and his colleagues were all safe, and said that when he was able, please get back to me. And I didn't expect to hear from him for hours or days, but I heard from him within 30 minutes, and he said that in his 60 years, that was the most terrifying experience he ever had on the 7th floor of their building as it shook. And while the building was shaking, he started to think about the room that he'd shown me on the ground floor of that building, which was full of the various mementos that he had received from the University of Oxford over many years of the relationship. And he said he didn't know why, but whilst the world was shaking, he was thinking about a plate that he had been given to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So when the world stopped shaking, the first thing he did was check that his family was fine and that his colleagues were fine. And then he went downstairs and checked, and he sort of decided in his mind that if the plate were cracked, so might the relationship with the University of Oxford be. And when he arrived on the ground floor and went to see the plate was intact. And I remember reading his email, and the first thing I did was cry because I was so profoundly moved by it. And the second thing I did was email him back and say I was enormously relieved that he was safe and his family and colleagues were safe, and that I looked forward to the next 400 years of our relationship. Philanthropy at our institutions is the result of such personal relationships, and these relationships take time and they take care. And I'd like to consider for a moment what we heard about late last year, which was the largest lifetime gift to an institution in the United States. The news of Michael Bloomberg's historic gift to Johns Hopkins University created a profound sense of excitement and awe. Amongst the members of the educational community, there were many excited conversations at colleges and universities around the country and the world about how we might use this inspirational act of philanthropy to reinforce and build our conversations with donors and encourage investment and increased investment in widening access to higher education. And in fact, I heard of a story several days later of a donor to a university in the UK who was so inspired by what Michael Bloomberg had done that he determined to make a very significant investment to support students of that institution also, and a connection was created between him and Michael Bloomberg. However, after that magnificent announcement, some of the headlines and subsequent media conversations focused on two implicit criticisms. The first, that the gift could be put to better use elsewhere, and the second was that the gift won't make a big enough difference at an elite institution. Well, I'd start off by responding and saying it's hard for me to imagine how this gift could not make a difference. Not only will it make a difference to Johns Hopkins and to future generations of students there, but it has already made a difference in the consideration of many donors through the example and inspiration it provides. And here's what I'd argue the pundits missed with their opinions on this tremendous story. Donors give to causes about which they are passionate and to organizations that they have come to know and to trust and to respect. People are inspired to give because they are motivated by institutional mission and purpose and by passion for the impact that the gift will have. Philanthropy works best when it involves the donor in determining how and when the gifts will have the most impact. And it is also critical that key colleagues from the institution work closely with the donor in developing a proposition that aligns with the institutional priorities. And gifts at every level to education truly do move the needle in transforming lives and society. We were very fortunate to have the opportunity at our CASE Summit in New York last year to hear from Michael Bloomberg about his support for the university. He invests philanthropically in Johns Hopkins because his experience there quite simply transformed his life. And he wants to do the same for others so that they could benefit from a transformative experience that they otherwise could not have. And he chooses to do this in a way that would accomplish that outcome in perpetuity. And he has now made a clarion call through his most recent gift to others who have the capacity to follow his lead. The decision to give $1.8 billion with such specificity around its purpose took much thought, understanding of the university and its needs, and conversations, of course, with the president, with key faculty, with staff, students, and administrators to plan together how the intentions of the gifts could be realized. The gift has been criticized by those believing that the money would have helped other institutions more, but this criticism misses an important point. Michael Bloomberg's relationship with Johns Hopkins University began years ago, decades ago, as an undergraduate. In fact, his first gift to the university in the late 1960s was made as a $5 gift, and at the summit, we had a slide showing the gift card of that very first gift. Relationships with one's educational institutions are lifelong, and it's my hope that the inspirations from Michael Bloomberg's generosity encourages people to identify giving opportunities which help advance education in a way that matters most to them, connecting their values with their chosen institution's mission. And though relatively few of us have the capacity to give at the level of Michael Bloomberg, it doesn't mean more modest gifts are not equally important or less appreciated. Philanthropic investment at every level, in my experience, is vital for advancing education, and the breadth of opportunity for making a difference through donations is significant at every educational institution and in every part of the world. Whether we have the capacity to give $100 or $100 million, I argue that we should give what we can to have the greatest impact to touch people's lives. And also giving is far more gratifying when you know you're investing in making a difference and trust the organization tasked with implementing your intention. In my experience, giving can and is as transformational for the donor as it is for the institution. Which is why the recent conflation of the generosity of philanthropy with outright bribery and fraud causes me grave concern. We have all heard the continuing news stories about a consultant who worked with his clients to bribe individuals at institutions in order to secure places for their clients' children. And then a leap was taken in many of those stories as that people should have just made a donation to the institution instead. The conversation about these illegal activities have characterized charitable contributions in a way that are simply not accurate nor ethical. To hear the assertion that philanthropy is a backdoor into our institutions is not only incorrect, but it also trivializes the importance of giving to our institutions. The misperception is really important to address. There are ethics that advancement professionals and institutional leaders uphold with regard to philanthropic support for our institutions. And events like this reinforce a lack of understanding about the way higher education has evolved and the impressive breadth and range of educational opportunities in the United States, attracting students from within our shores and from far beyond. When we hear stories about the recent admissions scandals, through inaccurate stereotypes about higher education institutions, it sounds like the sky is falling in, and students won't have a place at college, and that college is the purview and playground of the elite. There is a place for everyone who wishes to pursue higher education in the United States. This is not true in all other countries in the world, where there is not the diversity of offering or the relative ease of access to higher education. This is the true narrative about higher education in this country. In fact, Margaret Spellings, the former Secretary of Education for George Bush, wrote last year in the Chronicle of Higher Education, "Mass education is an American innovation. From universal high school to the GI Bill," she noted, "the United States has long championed accessible higher education." And June 22nd of this year will mark the 75th anniversary of the signing of the GI Bill, enabling veterans to access higher education in gratitude for their remarkable service. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the College of St. Rose's designation as a veteran-friendly school and topping the military-friendly school list for 4 years. Education and access to education is transformative. And this is a concrete illustration of the power and promise of higher education and an example of the public good education provides across all types of institutions, public and private. I read recently about 2 economic impact studies of institutions in New York, one about the impact of the State University of New York system and one on the impact of New York's independent colleges, both showing the treasure of these institutions to the Empire State and the value, economically and civically, of your colleges and universities to the people and to the state and to beyond. The state's independent colleges and universities generate $88.8 billion to the state's economy and support 415,600 jobs in New York. The state's public institutions generate a further $28.6 billion and support nearly 180,000 direct and indirect jobs. Pretty amazing. Which leads me to another challenge we face here in the United States and to a degree in other English-speaking countries, the shift in perception of higher education from a public good to a private good. Many studies have shown the personal benefit derived from higher education. We see it through salary differentials over time, through health and community engagement metrics and other measures. And at the same time, there is vast public benefit from higher education institutions for communities that surround colleges and universities locally and globally. A recent UNESCO analysis looked at impact of educational institutions based on a number of different factors. In addition to the obvious contribution to human capital, the UNESCO analysis showed that when new colleges and universities were added in a region, its GDP per capita rose by 4%. They identified that this increase was not simply due to the additional spending by the workforce and students of that institution. The study showed that increasing numbers of skilled graduates raised productivities in the firms they work in, and that innovation generally is boosted throughout the region as measured by increase in patents. What this indicates to me is that we need to do everything we can to ensure that our colleges and universities thrive, and they are accessible to all who wish to attend, and that the student experience for those who attend is a transformative one. We also find ourselves in an era in many parts of the world in which decreasing government support is raising the cost of an education for students and families, and which philanthropic support of educational institutions is becoming more and more essential. In the UK, where this is relatively new, we are seeing much greater participation and higher levels of private support than ever before. And according to research that CASE conducts, over £1.07 billion was raised in the UK and Ireland in 2017 and 18, and that's the highest figure to date and represents an increase of 6% over the previous year. And in the US, philanthropic contributions to education totaled $46.7 billion in that same year, up 7.2% over the last year, according to the Voluntary Support for Education Survey, this VSE, which is part of CASE's AM Atlas Global Advancement Data and Analytics Resources. Philanthropists, from alumni contributing $5 or £5 to game-changing 9-figure gifts like the one referred to earlier, all recognize the continuing importance of education to transform not only individual lives, but also greater society, and they are stepping forwards in unprecedented ways. Education's role in teaching people to think, to be curious, and to discern fact from fiction is more important now than ever. Moreover, the research and knowledge leadership that comes from colleges and universities has created whole new industries, increased productivity, improved our day-to-day existence, saved lives in our physicians' offices and in our hospitals, and given us new insight into our lives and those of our neighbors. Colleges and universities are critical drivers of the health and well-being of our communities. Research conducted by faculty provides the insights and innovations that drive our economy, shed light on problems, and find solutions that enrich our culture. The Pew Research Center in 2017 showed that a majority of Americans no longer expressed a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. Gallup research suggests that political, cultural, and economic concerns are closely linked to this diminishing regard for many sectors of establishment in society. In the Brexit campaigning in the UK in 2016, Michael Gove MP, who is currently serving as the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and at the time served as the Secretary of State for Education, complained people in this country, in the UK, have had enough of experts, and that they should trust themselves. And former Florida Governor Rick Scott announced that we don't need a lot more anthropologists. At the same time, there are strong advocates who speak out in support of the importance of education and learning. Writer and actor Stephen Fry, for example, in the Fry Chronicles, argues that the only reason people do not know much is because they do not care to know. They are incurious. Incuriosity is the oddest and most foolish failing there is. Film director Ridley Scott, no relationship to Governor Rick Scott as far as I'm aware, who was awarded the British Academy of Film and Television Arts Fellowship in 2018, which is a lifetime achievement, focused his thanks unusually in an award speech upon his teachers and his education. He said, "It's extraordinary what an enthusiastic teacher can do, drawing the student out, igniting independence, and encouraging a design of your own future rather than waiting for something to happen. Teaching is the most important of all professions. Sort that out, and social problems will get sorted out. Sounds simple. We've been talking about it for years, but it's absolutely vital." My personal experience of studying at university taught me many things, not least of which was the joy of learning. I also discovered the inherent truth that my work there was an opportunity for me to grow and develop and to succeed in what I was passionate about. Colleges and universities are complex environments brimming with brilliant faculty and dedicated professionals. At the same time, educational institutions can find themselves caught up in the context that is becoming increasingly polarized, like many of the political issues of the day, not least of which relates to perceptions around freedom of speech on campuses. And in my experience, the vast majority of colleges and universities make every effort to protect it. Even still, the polarity of society inevitably affects our work. The disputes over arts versus sciences, workforce training versus critical thinking, Republican versus Democrat, facts versus alternative facts, and even national versus global. As a US and British citizen who's lived in Australia, the last of those three confuses me more than any of the others. Surely there is room for every perspective. Furthermore, I would argue that education has an enormous responsibility to provide the vital role, and a more vital role than ever, to build an understanding of the nuances between those widening poles. We live in complex times that require thoughtful conversations. Educational institutions provide a vital home for the pursuit of knowledge and for conversations around the complex issues and challenges that face us as a people and a planet. Advancement professionals, institutional leaders, and volunteers often have a unique vantage point on the institutions they serve, at the intersection between external and internal communities. And at that intersection, they hear and see things. They open doors to opportunity for our institutions and for the communities in which they flourish. They share insights. They bring people together who might not have the opportunity to engage without their introductions. They create meaningful opportunities for engagement and participation by introducing communities to one another. And they help alumni and others reconnect and become reacquainted with our schools, now colleges and universities, and rediscover the wonder of what takes place at our campuses. They operate at that vital intersection, opening doors and opening eyes. And we know those open doors and open eyes often result in opening hearts and minds, which I believe is fundamental to learning. If we look only at the headlines without digging deeper, we can become distracted from the reality of the impact of higher education in this country and indeed around the world. When we at CASE know through our work that communities rally to support the colleges and universities they love and respect because they value the connection, the opportunity, and the service these colleges and universities provide. Why did the fire at Notre Dame and the images of the first black hole quickly captivate an entire world? Is it because the speed at which information travels? That is a piece of it, but I like to think, though, that it is something much deeper. Notre Dame Cathedral is a place of deep symbolism, of history of both religious importance and symbolic and cultural heart of a nation. It is a place of present importance that reaches deeply into the French soul. It is a place of meaning. The first images of the black hole are different, yet similarly evocative. They are the realization of centuries of scientific and mathematical exploration. The constellation Virgo was named by Ptolemy, and Einstein's theories postulated black holes. Ada Lovelace, an English mathematician, wrote what may be considered the first computer program, and Katie Bauman, a young American computer scientist who wrote key algorithms leading to the first black hole images, personified much of the excitement of this discovery through her unbridled enthusiasm at the announcement of the achievement. Connection to the past, relentless inquiry and curiosity drive humanity and have driven humanity since the beginning of time. Our colleges and universities have long been the hubs of these pursuits, connected to their many communities, connecting scholars to one another, connecting students to scholars, connecting employees to employers, connecting people across the opinion divide. In a time when news cycles are noted in seconds and sound bites, colleges and universities can and do play a vital role in creating that necessary pause, providing space for perspective, testing theories, creating possible solutions, shedding light on the rapidly changing era we inhabit. This is the power of education. It transfixes people. It transforms lives. In tuo lumine videbimus lumen, in your light we shall see light. Thank you.
I don't know, we have a little bit of time for some questions, and Lisa will walk around and collect your cards. If you have any questions, I hope you do. Yes, we're seeing cards come forward on that side of the room anyway.
Oh, marvelous. Excellent. Thank you very much. Lovely. Thank you to the brave person who wrote this question. Oh, bear with me. This is a serious question. Relationships that take time and care. I very much agree, but how does that work at a time are great, and these relationships are increasingly... Sorry, I'm just reading it. I'll come back to you in a second. Okay, I'll read it. Does the writer mind if I read it out loud? Jolly good. And I'm very pleased to say their handwriting is a lot better than mine. Please say more about relationships that take time and care. I very much agree, but how does that work at a time when university financial needs are great, and these relationships are increasingly becoming the glue that holds institutions together as existing higher education business models are failing? Well, I think that's a wonderful question, and I think the way I'd frame my response to that is to say that I've been fortunate to work in institutions. I cannot remember, I haven't worked anywhere where money has been no object. The sense of financial pressure has been a constant. But if the essence of philanthropic engagement or engagement is about building relationships, I think understanding the need and the importance of respecting that for people to do something that involves what may be a significant philanthropic investment for them, there needs to be the time and attention taken to build that relationship over time, and not to, it's sort of, and certainly I've talked with people working in institutions who say there's enormous pressure to be going out and asking people who have not been particularly engaged with the institution. And it's sort of like the first time you meet somebody asking them to marry you, and I don't know if any of you have done that and how successful that was. But I think ultimately there's a greater potential to damage the relationship by doing that. At the same time, I mean, one sees all sorts of initiatives which engage donors much more broadly now, which are far faster. I mean, a number of institutions are now doing annual giving days, which are arguably more about participation than about the sums that they raise, but creating a real sort of frisson energy about the opportunity to support and engage with the institution by having a day a year where you're highlighting a key opportunity for investment or a key program, or connecting people with the people that they used to sit and have lectures with or learn from, can be a far more, it's a sort of almost a kind of crowdfunding. It can be a far more immediate source of building philanthropic support. And at the same time, I'm genuinely of the view that philanthropic engagement will have much greater success and be sustainable for much longer if one can give it the time that it needs to build it appropriately and respectfully, and ensure that the priorities of the donors and the institutions are married so that the outcomes are things that are vital both to the donor and the institution, and rushing it sometimes can result in something that doesn't achieve that outcome. So how do you deepen the industry of higher education as not only a private but a public good? That is a great question. Thank you for whomever asked that question. And I'm sure that our president has many responses to that as well. I mean, I think one thing I'd say is I think there's a job to be done, and CASE is working with a number of other associations to think about how most effectively we support our members in doing this, about the communication about the immense public good that higher education is delivering. And I think I would argue that we've not necessarily been as good as that as we might have been. And for example, the illustrations I gave in this speech about the huge economic impact that schools and colleges and universities are having in this state alone is mirrored across this country and in different parts of the world. And yet we're telling those stories to each other, but the extent to which we're telling those stories more broadly across our communities, I think the public good is immense, and of course there can always be more public good done, but I just think that we're not telling it well enough. And one of the things I'm excited about seeing how much more we can develop it. If one takes the United States, roughly a quarter of people in the United States have benefited from studying in higher education. Imagine if a quarter of the people in the United States were informed of the 3 or 4 things, not myriad materials, because we all get overwhelmed by lots of things to read and absorb, but the 3 or 4 things that their institution is doing in their community or that's impacting the public, sort of short, key pieces of information that they can share in turn when we're buying our groceries, when we're out doing whatever we're doing during the day, to be able to communicate to people, did you know that my college has done X in terms of widening access, or has done Y in terms of improving levels of reading in elementary schools, or is doing, the incredible projects that are happening are profound, and I just don't think we're telling them loudly enough or clearly enough yet. Individually at an institutional basis where there is great work being done and emerging, but also across the whole sector, I think there is much more we can be doing. And as I said, we're exploring more and more what we can do in that space. And my colleague Amanda is a key player in that. Thank you. And I'm incredibly grateful for this great handwriting as well. Thank you all. One of my most embarrassing moments early on as president of CASE was we were saying farewell to some of our trustees, and I'd done handwritten cards to them, and on the evening we were giving them at a dinner, one of the trustees stood up to read my card, and he couldn't because of my handwriting. So what are we doing about the high discount rates? I think, and obviously there could be many meanings behind this question, and so I'll give an answer, but the President might well want to respond as well. I think one of the messages that is most confused in the US higher education context is around the pricing of higher education. And as we all know, institutions such as this one work incredibly hard to discount the sticker price for higher education in order to enable as a broader range of people to study as possible, and ideally to move to a place where there's needs-blind access. But I think there's a lot of sort of opacity about what it does cost. And indeed, when we hear stories around enormous levels or inordinate levels of student debt in this country, and indeed the total sum is deeply alarming. But if you look at the average level of student debt, it's much less alarming than some of the stories that we hear. So my sense is that, and I think the financial model for higher education in this country does have its challenges and does need redressing. But I think there's also a piece to be done around communication. And the final thing I'd say is I think there's also something to be learned, and I know there's been some exploration looking at other places, and those that I'm most familiar with, Australia and the UK, both of which there is tuition that is paid by students, but the whole structure of financial aid and student loans is far, far more forgiving than it is in this country. So there are incredibly low interest rates. In the UK, if you haven't repaid your student loan after 25 years, it's forgiven. In Australia, if you go into certain professions, it's forgiven. You don't start paying it back until you're earning over a certain amount. I mean, it's far more sensitive and less overwhelming, I think, than it is here. And I hope that there will be an effort to look more clearly at what's happening elsewhere.
So last question over here.
Please, thank you. Do you think the deciding factor in the decision to give should be a matter of hierarchical class or individual preference? Gosh. I think the decision to give must be a combination of an individual seeking to invest in a way that is meaningful for them and aligning with the institutional's mission. There was an example which this makes me think about when we were fundraising to build a School of Architecture at the University of Melbourne, and there was a program in the 1960s called the Colombo Plan, where Australian universities provided, or the government provided, grants for people from Singapore and Indonesia to study in Australia. So there were a number of people who'd studied architecture in Singapore at the University of Melbourne. So I spent a fair bit of time in Singapore seeking philanthropic support there together with the dean. And I learned very early on that there was a real hierarchy there around philanthropy, in that there was a sense that that people should not give more than the most senior person, as in the oldest person in that group of architects in Singapore. So had I gone to people in the group who had gone to university later on, before going to that person first, there would have been a real sort of uncertainty and unhappiness about that. So again, that cultural respect is really important. But my sense is here, and in the UK and in Australia, it's far more about being what's important to individuals, and the institution encouraging people to aspire to invest significantly for them because of the profound difference it will make. So I'm not sure that hierarchy has a role to play in my experience beyond Singapore, and perhaps Hong Kong, actually.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.